Thank you. I will talk today about the neural correlates of externally and internally originating emotional distraction effects on working memory. From the beginning, what is emotional distraction? For example, you have a main task like driving, and you happen to drive by a scene of a car crash. Then your attention might be captured by this stimulus, because emotional stimuli, they usually have enhanced relevance for the survival of the individual. And hence, momentarily, you can engage your attention away from the main task, which is driving, and become distracting and looking at the car crash. And this might further impede on your ability to properly drive the car. Another source, so this would be a distraction coming from the external environment. But distractions can also come from the internal environment. For example, unwanted thoughts or ruminations that can negatively affect, again, goal-oriented performance. For example, being anxious about an upcoming exam, and a person has difficulty in concentrating on the actual material because has these recurring thoughts of what can go wrong. So the idea is that these distracting events can come from both the external and the internal environment. Previous investigations have looked at the impact of negative external distraction on ongoing goal-oriented processing, and have identified the fact that these are linked with a pattern of increased activity in the ventral affective system, illustrated here by the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, where emotional distraction generates increased activity relative to both neutral distractors or a control scramble distractors condition, meaning that this area is engaged more when the subject is confronted with emotional distraction. And simultaneously, there is a pattern of deactivation in dorsal brain regions, such as dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and lateral parietal cortex. And Pauline has talked earlier about the role of this network in attention and working memory. So then when the subject is processing emotional distractors, the level of activity in this region becomes lower. So there is a deactivation, and this deactivation is specific to emotional distractors, and it's relative to both the neutral and the control scramble distractors condition. This pattern has also been linked with differences in working memory performance, meaning that this deactivation in the dorsal region and the increased activity in this ventral areas is associated with lower working memory performance in response to emotional distraction. Also, this pattern was originally identified in subjects suffering with emotional disorders, such as depression. But there are longer states. However, this pattern has been shown to also be elicited when the subjects are confronted with transient events, that is, transient emotional distraction. So, these previous investigations have generally used only negative events, negative distractors. And it is not known whether similar effects are produced by distractors with different characteristics, such as positive distractors, and also by distractors originating from within the individual, which, like I said before, are more similar to these distressing thoughts that occur in clinical settings. Therefore, the two open questions are whether the distracting effects are mainly driven by emotional arousal, and whether the distracting effects are also sensitive to emotional valence. And the goal was to investigate the role of arousal and valence in the impact of task-relevant emotional distraction on working memory performance. Now a little bit about these two, about arousal and valence. These are two basic emotional dimensions. Practically all emotional stimuli can be categorized into this bidimensional space, ranging from a low arousing stimuli, that is stimuli that elicit calm, to high arousing stimuli, which are stimuli that are exciting. Also, on the valence scale, stimuli can range from negative stimuli, that is unpleasant, to positive stimuli, which are pleasant. So practically all these stimuli, all these, in this case, emotional pictures, can be categorized into this bidimensional space. Now, an ideal way of investigating the roles of arousal and valence would be a design like this, where you would have high arousing, negative, positive, and neutral stimuli, and low arousing, and also high and low arousing, negative, neutral, and positive. However, this has been proven almost impossible because what people usually use, it's this instrument called the International Affective Picture System, where a large number of pictures have been rated on both these dimensions, arousal and valence, and they show up like this in this space. As you can see, the overlap between this ideal case and this real case, it's not that good. And people have been trying doing separations in different ways. We also have tried doing this separation, and we ended up with these 5 non-overlapping cells in which we have high arousing, positive and negative stimuli, also low arousing, negative and positive and neutral stimuli. Importantly, all these categories were independent in terms of high and low arousal and negative and positive valence, a fact that allowed us to investigate these effects independently. Regarding the task that we have used, it's called a delayed response working memory task with emotional distraction. The subjects performed this task inside the fMRI scanner. At the beginning of each trial, they saw 3 human faces. They were instructed to keep these active in their mind for a duration of a delay interval, and then they were later probed in respect to this set, whether the single face was old or new, meaning it was one of these 3 faces or not, and then they rated their confidence. Now, in the delay interval between the memoranda and the probe, different types of distractors were shown, and they could be either positive, negative, or neutral, both high and low arousing. Importantly, however, the 2 stimuli were always from the same category. That is either negative high or negative low, and so on. We had 2 hypotheses. The first one is, if the distracting effects are driven by arousal, then we would expect similar effects for positive and negative stimuli. The second hypothesis referred to valence. That is, if the distracting effects are sensitive to valence, then we would expect different effects for positive relative to negative stimuli. In terms of behavior results, we have obtained an increased performance to positive distractors. So positive distractors were associated with enhanced working memory performance relative to the negative ones, and there were no significant effects for the arousal level. This suggests that the positive stimuli might be associated with a facilitation of processing or broadening of attention effect that facilitates working memory performance, in this case when confronted with positive stimuli. In terms of reaction time, that is how fast the subject responded to the probe, we identified increased reaction time for the negative relative to the neutral stimuli, and to high arousing relative to the neutral stimuli. So this shows that there are deleterious effects for the negative and high arousing stimuli relative to the neutral ones, which is consistent with previous results investigating the effects of high arousing and negative stimuli. In terms of brain imaging data, first we identified similar effects for positive and negative distractors in the lateral prefrontal cortex. So consistent with the image I shown before, there was increased response in these ventral, lateral, prefrontal areas to both positive and negative high arousing stimuli, and there were also a deactivation in this dorsal, lateral, prefrontal cortex area in response to high arousing positive and negative stimuli. So overall, this is consistent with previous results showing that the high arousing stimuli generate this pattern in ventral and dorsal prefrontal areas. Regarding valence, there was greater effect for positive valence in the amygdala, which were driven by arousal. So there was an increased response to positive high arousing stimuli in the bilateral amygdala, which may be linked with the fact that the subject had increased performance to working memory, given that this area has been linked to memory processing. And we also identified an anterior to posterior dissociation in the medial prefrontal cortex, which showed that positive stimuli were associated with increased activity in this anterior region, and negative stimuli with a deactivation in this posterior region in the medial frontal cortex. Interestingly, the level of activity in this region was linked to worse working memory performance, which suggests that this area, which has been previously linked with self-referential processing, might show an interaction between valence and this processing and these processes linked to processing information related to the self. So in conclusion, we identified an enhanced performance for positive distraction, which can be linked, which suggests a facilitation or processing effect, and deleterious effects for the negative and high arousing distractors, which are consistent with previous findings. Overall, there was a replication of this dorsal-ventral dissociation with similar effects for positive and negative in the lateral prefrontal cortex, consistent with an effect of arousal. But we also identified dissociating effects driven by valence, with an increased response to positive distractors in the amygdala, and positive and the positive-negative dissociation in the medial frontal cortex, which suggests an interaction between valences and processes linked to self-referential processing. Reduced activity in this region, like I said, was associated with increased working memory performance. The next step would be to investigate the role of internally originating distraction, because, as I said, in clinical studies have been shown that people experience negative feelings and increased distraction in response to these internal generated events, and these were observed in PTSD and in depression patients. So the idea would be to further investigate this network, how this network relates. So this network, which was involved, which is called the default mode network, and it has been involved in generating internal thoughts, how this activity in this network interacts with this ventral and dorsal networks that we have been identified with external distraction. Thank you, and if there are any questions.
Thanks very much.
Seems like we only have time left for one question, perhaps. So is there a question from the audience?
I have a question. Do you see a lot of individual differences? Like, some people maybe aren't good at recognizing faces, and some people are kind of maybe psychopaths?
Yes, there are individual differences in both the way, like the basic working memory capacity here would be linked with how good people are in recognizing faces. We also use some other measures of working memory to correlate this and see whether, because we want to make sure that these effects are generated by distraction per se and not triggered by individual differences in this basic working memory processes. But more importantly, there are important differences in cases in which, so in the impact of emotional distraction. So we have, in this case, there were subjects who have shown a pattern of emotional response in terms of how they classified these stimuli, which is very much like to the group pattern and is very much like to the standard way in which we separated those based on the normative scores. But there are also subjects who show great variability. So, for example, they would rate the neutral stimuli as being more negative, or the high arousing as being more low arousing. So we want to look into how these individual differences further impact the way these networks in the brain are interacting.
Okay. Well, let's thank Alex once more.
Thank you.
And remember that Alex and all the other graduate fellows will be presenting their posters next week, Thursday, between 3 and 5 in the atrium.